Many thanks to the partners in the event today, partner events, Scranton Fringe Festival and Tech Bash for co-promoting the events. Thank you so much for sharing the love. Our next presenter is Jennifer Crawford. She's, is it the right time? Wow, it's 11. Okay, great. Jennifer Crawford has never had a real job and is happily unemployable. She is an enthusiastic, creative entrepreneur and the co-host of the award-winning Jellyfishin Show podcast, a funny show about weird business. She is also the founder of DC Podfest, a 2-day podcast intensive festival that focuses on the creativity and influence in the podcast medium. When she is not speaking into a microphone, she runs her company, Social Media Rescue. There, she is on a mission to help other entrepreneurs infuse personality into their online marketing while using social media intelligence and extreme customer service to grow their business. Her favorite breakfast is a nice, hot bowl of stress. So in lieu of therapy, she performs regularly with improv troupe, the Improv Imps. Is that the correct way to say Improv Imps? Yeah, cool. Let's give it up for Jennifer and You've Got Their Eyeballs. Now get their ear holes. Why bloggers should consider podcasting.
Hey everybody, how are you? I'm so happy to be here, believe it or not, because I am actually an introvert. And I was wondering if I have any fellow introverts in the audience. If you're not too shy to raise your hand, yay! Okay, so I may present as an extrovert, but I definitely identify as an introvert. And that's why podcasting was a perfect platform for me. Because I talk to more people than are in this room every week. I just don't have to make eye contact with any of them. So I can get my message out there on my own terms. So for all you fellow introverts out there, it's a very big reason to consider podcasting. Because just because you're shy or introverted doesn't mean that you don't have anything to say that's important. And you should definitely not muffle your voice because you don't feel comfortable expressing it. Podcasting gives you a place where you can be comfortable getting that information out into the world. Yay, introverts. So, you've probably heard the term snackable content as bloggers. I have a love-hate relationship with this word because I've been on Weight Watchers since May, so snacking is like a trigger word for me right now. But the reason you've heard this term so much is because we're having a real hard time keeping people's attention spans, right? So you've heard the statistic about the goldfish, we have less of an attention span than a goldfish, which is, it seems kind of insulting, but it's actually, I think, a way for us to adapt. We've adapted to having so much content thrown at us on a day-to-day basis, and we've adapted by being able to absorb that content quickly, which means it seems like our attention span is short, which it is. We're not spending as much time on blogs. We're looking at listicles instead of real substantive content. So that's why this statistic is super compelling, because on average, people spend 4 hours a day listening to audio content. So they're no longer goldfish. They're listening to audio content. You have their attention for an extended period of time. That gives you, the blogger, an opportunity to expand your message, flex your muscle, your message muscle, and give your audience longer form content that they can stick with. And why is it that they stick with it so much? There's reasons. They're less distracted. When I've got my headphones on or I'm listening to audio content, I'm not getting pop-up ads, I'm not distracted by news feeds. I can actually focus on the content. It's right in my ear, it's very intimate. Also, I don't need to be tied to a screen. I don't have to say no to other activities in order to enjoy a podcast. So if I'm watching a YouTube video or if I'm reading a blog, and I do read blogs, I love reading blogs, but that's the only activity I can do. And we're all time poor, right? We don't have enough time in our day. So anything that we can do to multitask is super valuable. And so your listeners can go about their day, do all the things they need to do. They can go to the gym, listen to your content. They can clean the house, listen to your content. They can walk the dog, listen to your content. It's really compelling. And this is just a pie chart, kind of boring. Just tells you where people are listening. It's roughly 50% at home and 50% on the go. This is really exciting because I do social media for a living. Podcast listeners are amazing people because they spend more time on social media than the average person. And it's actually a lot more time. Any of you out there listen to podcasts? Nice. Of you, how many listened to podcasts 3 years ago? A lot less. So there's this trend. Podcasting is kind of coming into its own. I started podcasting in 2010, and I didn't even tell people what I did. It was embarrassing. Now if you have a podcast, people are like, oh, cool, you have a podcast. So anyway, this is really interesting because of the US population 12 and over, if you're not listening to podcasts, you're visiting social media several times a day, about 43%. But that goes up to 60% for podcast listeners. So these are your people. I mean, they're hanging out on social media all day long. They can't wait to get good content and then do something with it. They're trigger happy with the like finger, I promise you. And it's across all platforms. Look, it's 10 to 20%. Every single social media platform, podcast listeners are winning. They're winning the social media game, as it will. All right, here's another reason to start a podcast. We have become very hateful about advertising. How many of you consume your television watching 100% on Netflix or some other similar service? And if you watch regular TV, how many of you fast forward through commercials? Yeah, we're not putting up with advertising anymore. And the advertisers have started to pay attention. And this is where this statistic is really important. So ad blocking increased 94% between 2015 and 2016. Oh my gosh, that is incredible. That is a whole shift in the marketing and advertising community. But what we found is that people, if any ad they're going to listen to, they're going to listen to an ad on a podcast. And why is that? Because we trust our podcast hosts. These are people we're getting to know. They're in our ears while we're doing all of our daily activities. That sort of becomes a bonding experience. For those of you who listen to podcasts, how many of you trust your host? If they say buy something, are you interested? Yeah, you're interested. 2/3 of podcast listeners have engaged in purchase behavior solely because the podcast host has had that item advertised on their podcast. That's a return on investment for advertisers that they have never seen in any other place that they've marketed. Not on print advertising, not on TV advertising, not on terrestrial radio. They've never seen those numbers. So advertisers are getting super excited about podcasts. Now that I've said that, I should say I'm actually kind of sad about that because I first started listening to podcasts because they didn't have ads. And it was an unpolluted way to get content that I liked. So I actually would advise to tread carefully when it comes to taking ads on your podcast, because I think you do run the risk of polluting your content, and there are so many other ways to monetize if that's your goal. So here we go. This is why I love podcasts. This is why I love consuming them. Podcasts are on demand, but they're not demanding. So I can listen when and where I want, again, without saying no to other activities. I mean, time is, the true non-renewable resource, right? Once it's gone, we can't make any more of it. We can make more money. We can't make more time. I'm a blogger. I just got done with a 30 days of blogging challenge, write one blog a day for 30 days. I was stressed out, not because I had to write a blog every day, but because what I was writing I didn't think was 110% quality, and I was asking for somebody's time to read it, time they can't get back. I take that really, that responsibility really seriously. And here you go. Podcasts allow you a deeper connection with your audience. When you have a deeper connection with your audience, what happens? They become loyal to you. They become rabid fans. They're going to engage in your content. They're going to share. They're going to buy things from you. You can't underestimate that power of connection. That human voice is so important. And we're living in a really over-filtered world, right? And that goes to blog posts too. You guys aren't putting a blog post out there that's not edited. You spell check it, you revise it, you push it out when you think it's perfect or close to perfect. You don't necessarily get that opportunity when you're putting audio content out there. They're getting your real voice, your real emotion, your real feelings. Even if you edit your podcast, they're still getting the real you. And that authenticity people really crave. It took me actually a long time to learn this lesson with my podcast. I've been podcasting about 4 years, and my business that I had while I started my podcast failed. And it failed bad. It was ugly, it was messy, I lost my shirt, I was embarrassed, I didn't think I'd ever recover, and I didn't want to talk about it. But one day I had a guest cancel, and I didn't know what to do. I was like, I'd been so used to just interviewing creative people, so my co-host and I decided to talk about my business failure. And I just laid it all out there. And our downloads just went crazy, like 3-4 times higher than they'd ever been. And I realized that at first I thought people just enjoyed my failing and wanted me to fail. But then I realized it was just because I shared something real, and people can relate to that. People fail. We're craving imperfection, actually, is what we're craving. Everything's way too polished. I should look at the time. Okay, I'm okay. And then here, I think this is a really understated benefit of podcasting. It increases your influence. How does it do that? Well, as soon as you have a podcast, it's kind of a cheat, actually. You kind of seem like an authority. If you have the Social Media Pros podcast, I think that one's taken. All of a sudden, I'm just going to assume you're a social media pro. So it is a cheat, but not without earning it, because it gives you an opportunity to make contact with people that you admire in your niche or your industry, people that are influential. It opens that door, because now, rather than just sending them a cold email, you have a reason to contact them because you have a platform, you have an audience that they can reach through you, through your podcast. And that's very flattering for a lot of people. Even smaller podcasts can get big name guests because people love the ability to reach a new audience. And then you get that opportunity to establish a relationship with somebody that you admire. And they are in your network now because you're having a conversation with them. The gift of authenticity, we talked about that. Podcasts are also powerful lead magnets. So this is one of those ways you can monetize without having an advertisement on your podcast. I use this example because this is one of the podcasts I listen to, and I've actually had an opportunity to interview this lady, Beth Below. She's the introvert entrepreneur. She has 0 ads on her podcast, but she's a business coach for entrepreneurs who are introverted, like me. And so she talks about that subject matter on her podcast. She never tells people, call me, I can be a coach. She doesn't say anything like that. But that, in conjunction with her branded blog, theintrovertentrepreneur.com, that becomes a powerful force. And she has a book now, too. And so if I need a business coach, she's the first person, I think. She's the only person I would pay to coach me. I trust her. Her content's out there, it's well branded, and she didn't have to sell me. content mileage. It gives you get content mileage out of podcasting. And one way you can do this if you're just starting a podcast is to go back to your old blog posts and make audio content on those topics. You're going to have a podcast host. Podcast hosting companies give you embeddable players. I love just embedding that player on the blog topic, and then all of a sudden you can share that podcast. It's attached to your blog post. You get fresh life out of it. And if you're just starting out, you don't have to think of topics. You can just attach your topics to your blog post. Now, I don't recommend reading your blog posts. I've known people to do that. But I think it's much more effective if you just use your real voice. Use it as an opportunity to expand on the topic, tell personal stories, let your audience get to know you, let them in a little bit. Why do we want to do this? The average American reads 19 minutes a day. And that's an American that falls within the age of 25 and 35. When you go younger, it goes down to about 9 minutes a day. When you go older, it goes up. So we're reading less. It's kind of sad. I was really surprised to hear that. I read much more than 19 minutes a day, but I understand why people are reading less. And people spend 3 hours a day watching TV. But if you remember the very first statistic I gave you, the average person spends 4 hours listening to audio. That's more time than they spend watching TV. That's really exciting. I think that should get all of us really excited to produce audio content. And that's just more social. I was supposed to take that out. It's not a good slide. Anyway, I think that's all I have. I think I actually might have a couple of minutes for questions. Yes?
What audio is it that we spend 4 hours listening to? Is that like the radio or what?
It's all, I think they consider it all audio. So it's music, it's podcasts, it's radio. But the fact is people are listening to audio longer because it's a more flexible platform. If you're listening to your music on your iPhone or whatever, you can do all those things that I mentioned that you can do with a podcast.
Yeah.
Yes, in the purple.
How do you deal with challenges of keeping your content both fresh and relevant when you get into ruts? Everyone does.
Oh, it's so hard, right? It's so hard. I struggle with that all the time. I tend to think about things that I'm going through personally because I podcast about creative entrepreneurship. That's something that's near and dear to my heart. Every week I'm struggling with something. No fail. There's something that's stressing me out or I'm struggling with or that I failed at. And I will talk about that because that is what my audience relates to. And I'm sure you have the same. And the thing is, sometimes the things we don't think are interesting or important actually are to our audience. Because sometimes the mundane is not necessarily mundane. What, you? Okay.
Yeah, I have a question.
Snapping.
If I happen to be a company in this room, let's say for example, Klein's Corner,
Okay.
and I wanted to start a podcast for foodies, what do you think of something like that?
I think it's good. I think food podcasts can be really successful. I will say this, niche down as much as you can. Really defining your audience, you want your audience to be as specific as you can. So you might think, oh, I'm going to catch more people if I just have a foodie show. But if you had a show about pudding, just pudding, the pudding podcast, steal it, you can take it. I guarantee you would be successful. The pudding podcast, I promise you, there'll be people that are crazy about pudding. You in the back.
First of all, thank you very much. Really good. In your experience, do you have an optimal length for podcasts?
An optimal link?
Length.
Oh, length. That's a great question. I will tell you this. People will tell you to aim for the average length of a commute, which I think is about 25 minutes. I don't really subscribe to that. I think go as long as it makes sense for you. Don't ramble. Make it entertaining. Have useful information, depending on the type of podcast you have. If you're a storytelling podcast, it may take an hour to tell a story, create a creative story, like one of those radio time stories. But if you're just giving out quick tips, I knew a podcaster. She's a scientist. She has a 2-minute podcast. 2 minutes, and it's just like a science fact, and it's really popular. And then there's Mark Maron's podcast, Joe Rogan. They're really popular podcasts. Their podcasts are hours long. and they do well. So it's just, I think it's quality is the main thing more than quantity.
I've never podcasted before. How much can you expect to spend on just basic equipment
Oh
if
my
you
gosh,
think
yeah.
about doing this on the basic level?
You can spend as much as deep as your pockets are, you can spend, but you don't need to.
But-
You can easily get set up for under $200.
Okay.
Yeah, easy.
Speaking of which, what would you recommend to set up? Like, is there a specific type of equipment that you have?
I don't have any recommendation. Only because I stay away from that because you can Google it and it's so personal and a lot of it depends on the type of show you're doing. Are you going to have guests? Are you going to have a co-host? Is it just going to be you talking into a mic? Are you going to have people calling in and interviewing? All of those things impact your choices for recording equipment and all of that. So I would say Google it and don't spend a lot of money on a microphone.
Could you share what you use as far as the program goes to record?
Yeah. We use Audacity and to record. I have a Shure microphone, and I host with Podbean. So our monthly expenses are pretty low, definitely under $75 a month. It's time. It's the time. That's the one. I was all very pro podcast, but I will say that it takes a commitment and it takes a lot of time. But you're already creating content, so you already have it in you to commit to something. So I definitely hope you do it. I think that's finally it. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Okay.